I'm Ann Reed, and I was at the Sacramento Bee from 1968 to 1984. I started in what was just the Women's Activities Department, and I ended as a special assignments reporter working on the impact of the influx of Vietnamese refugees in the valley and around the state.
Sigrid Bathen. I started at the Sacramento Bee about 6 months after Ann did, and in January of 1969, I was 22 years old, 6 months out of college, had newspapers and journalism. I was completely consumed by newspapers and journalism, which I had discovered in high school as a way to earn a living as a writer. And I'd worked for a TV station in LA, a live news talk show. And I didn't like living in Southern California. I didn't really like working in TV, although I had in other positions. And I walked into the Bee and got a job almost immediately. And I did not know at the time that I was possibly the first woman to be hired directly onto city-side reporting, not sent to the Women's Activities Department, where my good friend Ann and many other women were. Most women were in the food section or women's activities, social news, and I just wanted to be a reporter, and they put me to work. Technically, it was supposed to be an internship, but I immediately was covering general assignment. I covered, over the years, I covered courts, legal issues, went to law school for a time, decided to stick with journalism, and did a lot of healthcare reporting, as Ann did, and state prisons, state hospitals, state mental hospitals. I continue to cover mental health care today for Capital Weekly. And I left the Bee in December of 1981 to go to work, to cross over to the dark side, as reporters used to call it, which meant going into PR, political PR. I was press secretary to the state superintendent of public instruction, Wilson Riles, and then to Attorney General John Vandekamp. And then I returned to teaching and writing. So that was, my time at the Bee was a very important part of my career, and I continue to have contact with the Bee over the years as a press secretary, media director, and so forth, and as a writer.
Maybe I can fill in a little bit more if that's all right with you. I had worked in journalism since the 8th grade when I was a columnist for our junior high newspaper, but I didn't work for it again until I went to work for the Bee. I went to college. I worked for 4 years on the campus newspaper, and I applied my senior year for an internship at the Sacramento Bee. They were starting a new internship program, and so I applied, and lo and behold, I got the internship program based on clips and other things, experience. And I stopped at that point with my application to graduate school in journalism at UC Berkeley. And when it came out that I was ready to go to the internship program, I got a letter from a very nice man at the Bee saying, "We have decided that we need to delay our internship program. We hope you will apply again next year." At which time I showed my reportorial skills by getting up, going to Sacramento and saying, "I dropped out of graduate school to take this internship program. What can you do for me?" And I told them I knew Sacramento like the back of my hand. I'd grown up here. I knew how to cover stories anywhere they sent me, etc. Showed them clips. I had lots of clips from the 4 years. And they said, well, the only position we have available would be in the Women's Activities Center. And you'd like that very much. And I said, well, what about on the Sunday feature section, which is, I think, where you actually first started.
No? I went directly to Metro. The Camellia Festival.
Oh, God,
I was covering the Camellia Festival.
So I did start at the Women Activities Center, and my claim to fame is I ended up abolishing it. And it became the scene department. And I had a lot of work from a lot of people both men and women, who its time was done. When it was the society pages, we all used to laugh. There was no real society in Sacramento. Why don't we? And then it went to the women's pages. And that meant that if it had something to do with an extraordinary woman, you could probably write about it. But that was the most condescending way to cover women's achievements. Basically, you're saying, oh, look, a woman can do it. Or you're saying, well, you don't really belong there. Look, she's out on a line pole. She doesn't really belong there. So it was a kind of pejorative way to cover the achievements of women. I don't think everybody read the subtext the same way I did, but that's the way I read the subtext to a lot of what we were asked to do. And then when I'd been there 4 years, and as I said, we changed it to the scene department, and that time I went hard news.
Well, we formed the Women's Caucus.
Well, that was a 5-year fight, wasn't it?
Well, we started in 1970, 71. That file that I found in my archives said it was started in 1971, but I think we started earlier in 1970.
That's what I recall.
I know that. And that was affiliated with the Sacramento Newspaper Guild, which at that time covered both the Sacramento Bee and the Sacramento Union, and had quite a bit of clout at that time. And we were able to, accomplish a lot, but it was a very challenging, long road, and minor things like there was an opening for an assistant city editor on the city desk, which is not a lofty position, important position, and we suggested that there were qualified women who could do that job,
move into that position.
Editors who had worked in the women's activities section, which became the scene section as a result of a proposal that the Women's Caucus, a proposal written by Anne
and others.
It was we started off with a core committee of 5, so we all had to make decisions together, so they couldn't, pick on one person, because we got a lot of blowback, just very negative comments.
The Guild at that time was a closed shop operation, which meant you had to join the Guild in order to work at the paper. And so they did have a lot of influence. And I remember a young reporter saying, but I don't want to join a union. And they said, well, then you're not working here. It was that close. So you had to play ball with the union. They did a lot of good things for reporters, but it was very much the power path by which changes were made outside of management at that time.
There was also a minority affirmative action committee. We worked very closely together. And because the issues were very often were very similar in many ways. There was a lot of racism in the news business, both in terms of hiring and promotional opportunities and portrayal. There was a lot of sexism, misogyny, portrayal of women in insulting ways.
Disenfranchisement of whole groups of populations. It was very difficult to watch if you had a different perspective on the world. And remember, this was the 1960s. The world was changing. There was lots going on at the time that this began to really rumble loudly in the Bee newsroom. And we had been through the civil rights movement, or I had when I was in college for 4 years, that was very crucial to my college education. And so those are the values that we ended up bringing into that newsroom, which I think is what made the change. And then the women that were there, they were all gutsy enough to try and get a job at that newspaper. So they hired gutsy women by mistake and got what they deserved. When I tried to get my job after the internship program was canceled, well, what can I do? What are the paths I can take? Well, there really weren't any. Back to J school, which I did finish applying to and did actually drop out of then when I got the job, but it was a difficult time for a woman to try to get into any of those kinds of jobs anywhere on that newspaper.
I realize in retrospect, and I didn't have much of a sense of sisterhood or feminism. I mean, I just knew that I wanted to be a reporter, and I didn't want to cover, weddings and engagements. Not that those aren't important. I wanted to cover the news, And it was just a strange time because there just wasn't that opportunity for most women. After I went to work for the Bee, I got a call because I had interviewed at several of the TV stations as well. And it's in my master's thesis on women political reporters that I got a letter from Channel 3. I'd had an interview earlier with the news director, and the program manager wanted to meet me because the news director had been impressed. I was already working for the Bee, but I thought, I had done TV. Before that, I'd worked for a TV station in LA, and I'd done college media. I worked for KRCR-TV in Redding when I was at Chico State. There were only 2 TV stations at that time in the North Valley, and also for public television, which actually had a studio at Chico State. So I had a lot of experience. I'd been editor of my high school and college newspapers, and so I had all these clips. I had all this. I'd worked for a small newspaper one summer, and when I got to LA and got a job, but it was not exactly what I wanted. It was an associate producer of a live news talk show, which was fascinating to work for, a lot of hard work. And the women producers, we learned, were making significantly less than the men. But I didn't have much sense of, I just decided, well, I'm going to go back to Northern California. So I walked into the Sacramento Bee, and I had clips. And I think in applying for other jobs in LA, like the LA Times, you have to have worked for a major newspaper. That's what they told me. That's what they told me.
You had to have worked, even at the Bee. I was an anomaly because they wanted you to have worked for a community paper. College was great, and the fact that I'd been an editor and done all this stuff and written about demonstrations and changes in the law and things like that. They liked that, but they really wanted you to have worked for a community newspaper, the Reading Searchlight Record, or a medium-sized paper. And when we walked into the newsroom, it was the wild, wild west. These papers had run pretty much the same way for 50 or more years. All men, chain smoking, swearing, hard drinking. Didn't really want anyone in their way, did things their way. It was a rough place to work. It was the wild, wild west. And so I think, these 2 women to appear on the scene was really disconcerting to them. The first day of work, and I have a picture of it, a photographer came over to take a picture of me. Why? Because we hadn't got many women in here, and I was on the phone. And I look back at that picture and I think, was I 12? I was very young at 21. I was 21 when I went to work there. Yep. But it was a different culture and a different time. So I understand why there was a lot of irritation, I guess.
Well, there were a few older women who had worked their way up.
World War II.
And one was, in fact, I worked with her 5:30 in the morning writing photo captions. And she had, that's what she did. She wrote photo captions. She had been in the social section or women's activities before that. And then there was a woman who had been a correspondent. The Bee used to have a section called the Superior California Department. It was the early edition. It was designed to go out to the North Valley and Soup Cal, they called it. And she had been a correspondent. They were not, I don't think they were covered by the union, by the guild.
They got paid by the inch.
And she was a single mom, and she managed to get into the newsroom, but it was a fight. I was told I was the first woman to, walk in the door and be hired. And I didn't finish the story about Channel 3 calling me, after I'd gone to work for the Bee, and I went over and met with the program director and the news director, and we had this nice conversation, and then they asked me what kind of news did I want to cover. And I remember feeling, just very perplexed, like, well, news,
Real news.
and that was not at all what women were doing in TV at that time. They were, expected to be decorative. That's true to some extent today, unfortunately. And, it was like I'd poured ice water on their heads. I didn't want to just I didn't see myself as decorative, and I didn't see myself as a reporter on light subjects. So
at the time, there was no female anchor on any of the television stations in Sacramento. None.
And well, it was just a difficult time, and that was why we formed the caucus and the Minority Affirmative Action Committee. This was also a time. This was a civil rights movement. This was Vietnam War, and as Ann said, we were all schooled in that, I graduated from college in 1968.
Same year.
As you did. And one of the first stories the Bee sent me out on, I remember, they didn't have very many young reporters either. And they had one black reporter who was hired about the same time as I was. And Berkeley, People's Park, there was huge demonstrations.
Marches, and which is one of the
Berkeley.
reasons I dropped out of graduate school, is that I was in Berkeley walking down Shattuck Avenue one day, and the Blue Meanies came down the street tear gassing everybody.
Yeah.
And I ran into a shop, and she said, "You can stay here, dear," but there was tear gas. And on my way to journalism class one day, tear gas wafting all across the quad. And I called my dad that night and said, "I don't think I can stay here." And that's when I really decided to go see if the Bee might take me.
Yeah, well, I remember being sent down to cover it. I think it was me and one other younger
Wasn't it
reporter, male.
Speech?
Don Speech.
Don
yeah.
Speech. You and Speech went.
Our job was to talk, get the student point of view, because we weren't that long out of college. So we went around knocking on doors, dorms and apartments, and went over to the Daily Cal and watched all the blue helmeted police, marching in lockstep across campus. It was a pretty difficult
It was an intense time, and it's hard to convey that. And the fracture between what was before and then what was a pretty significant fracture in society, I think.
Well, I remember when we were forming the Women's Caucus, and Gloria Steinem was speaking to the Sacramento Press Club, because the meeting place where I think they were meeting at the old Clarion Hotel. And anyway, it was a huge crowd that covered it, and that was when you had to put your tape recorder up on the podium, And I was one of maybe 3 or 4 women reporters there. And the questions that were being asked were questions like, so when you go out to dinner with a man, do you pay or does he pay? And she just, did this
women's lib,
withering
feminism,
withering
shocking.
look, and she said, we're in the middle of the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, women's rights. I do not think these are important topics. Sometimes I do, sometimes he does. It doesn't, she just really shut him down. But the questions kept coming like that. Afterwards, she met with she did this apparently after all of her speeches with the women who were there at the speech. And I got permission from the city editor at that time. I think it was Aaron Epstein, because I was also covering it, so that was kind of could be a conflict, I suppose. And I asked her, I said, about the Women's Caucus, and she said, well, don't affiliate with the Guild. She said, you'll find that the newspaper guild is more difficult than, as difficult as dealing with management. And to some extent that was true, but we also had a lot of male supporters.
Good support from
Bill
some men.
Glacken, who was the wonderful arts and drama critic
He
for
was
the Bee
terrific
for
for us.
years and years.
And
He'd been
he-
a political reporter before that.
And Bill could talk to upper management. He'd been there
He was
for
close to
so
Eleanor.
long. He was close to Eleanor. He was a gentleman. He was seen as very, very bright. He was a Berkeley grad.
He was a great reporter, too.
Good reporter. And he could, take the message into places where it was harder to go from the next generation, so to speak. But they were very helpful, many of them.
But ultimately, we did affiliate with the Guild, and I'm glad we did, because I think there were times when we might have been fired.
Yes.
Because, I was getting asked to speak on panel discussions, and, in San Francisco, and the Bee had a policy that you didn't speak in public, and I always was very careful. Reporters report the news, they don't make the news, and that's a good rule to have. But I was very clear that I represented the Women's Caucus and not the Sacramento Bee.
Correct.
And in fact, I remember there was a panel discussion at the in Sacramento that was very heavily attended. It was in the SMUD auditorium, and I walked in.
Big auditorium.
Did not expect to see so many people, and thinking I'm going to walk in the next day and get fired, you know. But and I was on one of the panelists, and the program director who had interviewed me at Channel 3 was there, and Channel 3 had just I'm not bringing Channel 3 in for excessive criticism. It's just my experience. Channel 3 had just run a series on women's lib, which is a pejorative, and they used it in headlines all the time. Usually, I'm no women's libber. You know?
Yeah.
That would be the headline. But anyway, the lead-in, the film that preceded each segment of this, I think it was a 5-part series, and KCRA had a wonderful news department at that time, still does to some extent, and the lead-in was a woman walking down the street, dropping her bra into a trash can.
That was on fire? Was it on fire?
Yeah, on fire.
On
and
fire.
That never happened, for one thing, although it became emblematic of the women's movement.
Right, yeah. But it is interesting.
Anyway, the program director and I think the news director, they had to apologize to this room full of people because they were just getting slammed during this panel for using that kind of image. And a lot of it was imagery. It was, you know, the Miss Australian mink beach bikini, you know.
Page 2, every Friday, woman in swimming suit.
Yeah, sports columnists would write about, you know, this beautiful, attractive blonde, you know. And then there were all the stories about the first woman to climb a, pole for SMUD. Or,
Right,
you know,
I think I did that story.
And the headline would always be, I'm no women's libber.
Or,
well, okay, fine. And she's also attractive, and she has 3 kids, and she cooks for her husband every night. And
they were, it was,
right.
it was.
Women were described by their husband's name, Mrs. John Smith, Mrs., you know.
We got rid of that.
Finally, yeah.
We got rid of that.
I'm looking at the 1977 version of the AP Style book, which is the Bible for the dictionary for newspaper, for news media, still is today, and this is the 1977 edition, and this is the section on courtesy titles, 1977.
This goes to the Rose Bird thing.
Right. Use courtesy titles for women. Courtesy titles are Mr., Mrs.,
Doctor,
Reverend, you know. The New York Times still uses courtesy titles. The Wall Street Journal uses courtesy titles. But, I mean, they'll continue to say Reverend Jones or Dr. Jones.
And at the time, doctor was only an MD doctor.
Yeah, not a
If you were a PhD doctor, then you only carried the initials after your name and only on first reference. I mean, this was all tightly orchestrated.
But men were described by their last name, regardless of their courtesy title. You use the first reference, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but women, you know, the example we would use, you have to go up to a woman who's lying on a gurney after a major automobile
That's what I just
accident.
said with Rose Bird. Right. She was in the hospital, and she didn't want to be Mrs.
Right.
She wanted to be judge.
Well, I covered in the, let's see,
and she deserved to be judge.
One of the major stories I covered right after I got back from maternity leave in 1978. I started it in 77. Was a doctor, an MD, who was head of the alcohol and drug abuse section. Then it was in the State Department of Health. Josette Mondanaro was her name, and she had been terminated by Jerry Brown. And she filed a personnel board complaint, and she won. There's a public hearing, and the reasons for her termination were very complicated, and the personnel board ultimately did not agree with Brown. It's a complicated case, but it was really high profile because of everything was playing out in public, all the personnel issues that you don't usually see in public. But when I came back to write the stories, I had the style was that on second reference I had to refer to her as Ms. Mondanaro. They had started using Ms. finally in
Took us a while.
the 70s. But so she was Dr. Josette Montanaro on first reference, Ms. Montanaro on second reference. You had to use, you didn't say Mr., but you had to say Ms. or Mrs. and she was anyway, Frank McCullough was the managing editor at the time. He was wonderful. And the copy desk was saying, no, you can't do that, AP style and yada, yada. And so I finally said, I'm just not going to write these stories if that's the way it's going to be. And so they worked out a compromise that I would refer to her as Dr. Montanaro throughout the story, which I know this sounds minor and petty and silly, but we had to fight these huge battles.
And it's the thing about being fired. When I said no, I wanted to refer to her as Judge in second reference, and I was told, that is not our style. You do it in style. And I said, well, then if it's going to get changed, you need to be the person to own that, and you need to be the one to make the decision and change it, because, I'm not going to. And basically, I'm not at your pay grade. And I knew that C.K. McClatchy really stood firm on the use of gender titles.
I didn't know that.
Oh, well, he was the one, yes, who thought that with Judge Byrd, that the public had a right to know whether she was Miss, Mrs., or what. And there's a certain irony in that if you think hard, Sigrid.
The 1977 style book, if a married woman is known by her maiden last name, preceded by Miss on second reference, unless she prefers Ms., as in Jane Fonda, Miss Fonda. Ah! Anyway, it took forever to get the AP to change that. Most newspapers, as they had switched their women's activities sections to features section. I think Washington Post became Style, the Bee became the Scene. So that was evolving. Courtesy titles did not end at the AP until 2000. I thought most newspapers and other media weren't following it and were not using courtesy titles, just last name on second reference. Again, I'm getting into the weeds a bit here.
Well, we were talking about things were really changing, and we forget what is so ingrained in us. You were raised a certain way, you believe a certain way, and unless somebody trumps on that, you don't even know that it's a problem. Again, I got called down to C.K. McClatchy's office, and I said, does anyone know what this is about? Tremble, tremble. And no. So down I went, and C.K. was in a bit of a dither because the UC Regents had decided, actually it was just the UC Berkeley campus administration had decided that they were going to have women in the marching band.
Oh, heavens.
The reaction was far more than that. When I went down, he said, what do you think of this decision to put women in the marching band? It's going to ruin the whole thing. They'll ruin the whole thing.
When was that?
I have to look it up. I don't know. I can't come. And sorry, now I've lost my track of where I was going.
Marching band.
Yes. It's going to change the whole nature of the marching band. Well, how? Well, you're going to have 2 places to stay when they travel. You can't have men and women together. You're going to have bathroom facilities that can't be shared. It's going to cost a whole bunch to do this, trying to make it a money thing when it was a gender thing. And he said, that's going to wreck the marching band. And I said, yes, I do believe in it. And I went through my reasons for believing in it, giving women an opportunity to learn music, the camaraderie that is offered by such an organization, a new chance to diversify in their musical career, things like that. And he said, well, you're the most reasonable of those people in the newsroom. If you think they have to do it, then maybe they do.
Well,
and what he meant was the women's libbers. That's what he didn't say. Was, I was supposedly going to be reasonable about this, and then I blew his theory.
Well, that's why I asked when it was.
I don't know when it was.
For some reason, I kind of became the face of the women's caucus. We were supposed to have,
yes, she did.
Everything we did was a joint decision. I sent you some of the in-house cartoons that
and we used to pass little notes. I'm going down to talk to CK about the marching band, just so nobody out here gets fired over it.
And then it was prosaic kinds of things like, you couldn't wear pants to work.
Oh no, heaven
And one
forbid.
day I was working on it. We were working on
Well,
a
I
special-
started this problem, and then you
Yeah,
cleared it. I was doing a story out at the tower, the plane tower out at Mather Field, and I was going to the top of the tower because they now had 2 women controllers. Well, look what a woman can do.
Controller.
And so
I know women's
the
liberty.
PIO for
Get the
the
water.
Air Force Base recommended that I wear trousers for the interview because I had to go up these flights of stairs and there were people working down below the tower. And so I went and told my boss, they want me to wear pants. And he said, well, I guess you can if they've told you that's what you need to do. And so I came to work. No, so I went straight to the job, to the story, did the story, and came back to the office to write it up. And when I appeared in the newsroom in my high-end wool pantsuit,
These were not jeans.
these were not jeans or even slacks. This was a, nice-looking pantsuit. Oh, titter, 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 titter. People were running around, and somebody came up to me and said, you can't do that. And I don't remember who cleared it. And I said, he cleared it. I had to do it for work this morning. As soon as I'm finished here, I'll go home and change. And that's all that was kind of said. But there were people saying, Ann wore pants today. Ann wore pants today. Oh, look, Ann wore
Let's
pants
just
today.
get out there and cover the news, people.
And then Sigrid took it from there.
Well, I had permission also. I was working on a story. I mean, we were so nice, I was working on a story that involved, it was a story about racial discrimination in housing. It was for a special supplement
story.
called Black, Brown, White that was published by the Bee in 1969 on race. And I was going with the one black reporter at the time, and I would go out. We couldn't be together. He would go to an apartment to see if it was available, and then I would come a little bit later. And climbing in and out of cars, and I
Up and
asked,
downstairs
and it
to
was
the park.
hot. It was a summer project, and so I asked the city editor, and he said, "Oh, of course, no problem." And I wore a really nice, slacks. I remember, I think I bought it. There used to be a
These were not polyester, what
Joseph
we were
Magnin,
wearing.
nice knit shirt,
Yep.
And I walked into the newsroom, and nobody said anything, but they needed me for some breaking news. I think they needed an obituary written or something, and so the city editor was very nice. Chuck Irish. He asked me, he says, you can go out later on this other project. I said, well, and I asked him, I said, do you want me to go home and change? And because my apartment was only a couple blocks away, and he said, no, of course not. It's all right. Well, goodness.
Eleanor.
He didn't tell the managing editor, who was I'm not going to name names here, but
Different temperament.
very hot-tempered. And I was new. It was 1969. I'd been there a few months. And he yelled at me from across his cubicle, across the newsroom. And I walk in there, and he's in there with the personnel director. And we were already doing quite a lot of activism and women's issues and race issues, and so we weren't making ourselves very popular, and I kind of became the face of the women's issue, although I certainly wasn't the only one. And he just started screaming at me, and I wasn't used to being treated like that, I mean, and I was really shaken by it. And here's the personnel manager, and I don't think I was off of probation. I was on a 6-month probation at that time. So I very dutifully went home, and I even remember what I put on. I put on a blue sheath that my mother had bought me at Magnins in San Francisco, and a nice little circle pin. Of course, you had to wear hose and, proper shoes.
Proper shoes.
Little heels, and, that's the way it was.
I want
But
to pick. Yeah.
I remember we also had to deal with the city desk putting cheesecake photographs, they called them in those days, of scantily clad women, which were widely available on the AP
Oh yeah,
wire,
they came across. Titillation.
And they'd hang them, from where we had to turn in our stories, and so we.
I wanted to add on to what you said about you'd never been treated that way. I have to say, it was a wildly fun and interesting place to work. Smart, shrewdest people I've ever worked with. But it was barbaric in many ways. And that whole fear of being fired at any given time, on any given day, for the silliest of things was really real. And I remember talking to my father, as a matter of fact, about it, and he said, well, you've never been treated that way in your life. This is a different milieu that you're in. And Sigrid and many others, and many of the men too, but there was a real roughness about it.
Well,
and I remember if you got into a problem, the solution was, well, you handle it.
Mm. Well, I do want to say that when Frank McCullough came in what was that, 74, 75? Things changed substantially.
Yeah.
We did have a wonderful...
But he came out of the LA Times, so he came from a more sophisticated
Well,
background. He had experience in working in Vietnam on the magazine.
Been the Saigon bureau
chief in Newsweek or
Time Life.
Time
Yeah.
Life. And so there was a different level of experience, a different level of metropolitan understanding that he brought to the newsroom. And I do think that made a big change, that we had been run by local people pretty much, and now there was a different level. There were pros and cons to that with Frank.
Some people used to say that, you know, the Bee was run from the grave, and to some extent
That's true.
that was true. I remember when I first went to work, they handed me a copy of a hardback book by Eleanor McClatchy's father, who was also named C.K., and it was called C.K. Thinks.
CK.
Its literary value is, you know.
I think we all got one.
I read it, but you had to return it. And I worked at the Bee for about, I don't know, 6 months before I realized you couldn't say hot in a weather story, you know, because came out of, there, you know.
Had to be over 100 degrees to be hot.
Because the heat, don't you know, is what helps the crops grow. So you don't want to complain that it's hot. And supposedly Eleanor had been told this on her father. She was sitting on her father's knee, and he said, Eleanor, don't say it's hot. We need the heat, you know, for the crops, for the valley, for the, you know, the economy. And so we couldn't say hot. You had to
Very
say
warm.
Very warm.
Increasing in temperature.
Yeah,
We had a whole lot of
and
euphemisms.
For a period of time in the early 70s, I was the weekend city editor, which gave you a 4-day week, but you had no weekend because you're down in, you know, proofing pages at 2 o'clock in the morning. But you also assigned stories on Saturday, and that was during the United Farm Workers boycott, and there was a major demonstration, I think at a Safeway in Sacramento. And of course, you know, it's news, right? Send a reporter out. And I think Mel Osagай was on duty that day. And so anyway, somebody told me who was there in the newsroom, oh no, the Bee doesn't cover boycotts. I said, what?
Yeah.
And we didn't cover the story. I mean, the genesis of that black, brown, white supplement was because a number of reporters were very upset, myself included, because we did very poor coverage, or no coverage, of major demonstrations in Oak Park involving the police. The Black Panthers had a headquarters, and one of the people that I had interviewed was a young woman who was pregnant and said she'd been kicked in the stomach by a police officer.
And the only black person in Sacramento were Black Panthers if you were referring directly to the organization.
Right.
How many years did it take to change from Negro?
Well,
we used to
Bee-
fight hard for that,
Yeah.
and they weren't going to change it.
Well, it was Walter P. Jones was the editor, and Eleanor was the publisher, and it was a very, you know...
Times were changing.
It was my understanding that Jones thought black was insulting.
Yes,
you know.
pejorative.
We also had we worked with a lot of people in the community. There was a Community Coalition for Media Change,
Right.
which was a number of professors at Sac State, some influential lawyers, and they arranged for Nat Colley, a legendary black lawyer,
Nat,
and he came in to talk to Walter and tell him that saying black was okay. So they finally evolved and said that if you were older, I still have that memo somewhere. If someone was older and they were still Negro, but I mean the black, brown,
Older
white
professionals
But
were preferred
young
the
radical
term Negro.
were
Blacks.
black, like an Eldridge Cleaver was given as the.
So it was
a really absurd, and at base it was racist. And
Yep.
those of us who were out there covering stories, I remember covering it was right about the time Hiram Johnson High School was integrated, and they were bringing in black students. It had been primarily a white working class high school, and the black students were demonstrating because they were being treated very badly. We were getting these awful racist calls at the Bee about, some woman was attacked in a restroom or something. It was just awful. And there was, a demonstration of black students at Hiram Johnson High School, and I went out and covered it, but they were very upset that the Bee was referring to them as Negroes. And I said, it's not my policy. A lot of us we refuse to have bylines on our stories. Mm-hmm. And
you were in some ways jeopardizing yourself for future stories.
Yeah.
If you had a byline on it and you referred to people, as blacks and they wanted to be called Negro or vice versa, the others were not going to talk to you. So you needed to protect your byline.
Well, racism and sexism in the news is deep, systemic, endemic. One of the first assignments as a young reporter that you often got in those days was to go through the microfilm, for 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 25 years ago. And
we had a little column, 25 years ago today, 50 years ago today.
I mean, it was boring, but it was also sometimes really interesting. And I'm flipping through the microfilm one time, and I see a whole page. It's called Colored Notes. They had a whole page. And then, of course, there were the headlines about the yellow peril, big headlines like that. I'm sure you have them here in your archives. I'm so glad that those archives are being preserved, because I really worry about what happens to the all the stories.
But this was post World War II, mm-hmm. and a lot of the reporters were ex-infantrymen or other military, and these feelings and opinions were deeply entrenched. They weren't going anywhere fast. This is what they grew up on. This is what they grew up with. In fact, I'm thinking of Reed Jordan. He was the press officer to Eisenhower.
I knew he was in military media. He got really
military
mad
media.
At me because I wasn't doing. When we got the military briefs,
Mm-hmm.
We had to write stories about John Jones has been assigned to such and such, and I would save them up, and then I'd write several at one time, and he wanted me to do them as soon as I got them.
Well, he sat 2 desks away from me, and we used to have the most interesting discussions. But, he'd say, he smoked a cigar, blow the smoke right in my face, even when I asked not to. And when I was pregnant and asked not to have him smoke and blow the cigar smoke in my face, I asked to have my desk moved, and I was told, that's not going to happen. But anyway, back to Reed Jordan. Here's a guy who comes out of the trenches. I mean, he was a press officer with Eisenhower. He was close to him. You saw what he wrote. He wrote a lot of interesting war notes. And, he had a view of people who were not, as we said, Northern European, even though the war was basically with Northern Europeans. But he was deep prejudice against non-American people. And to end that, one of my sons is actually named Jordan Reed. Mm-hmm. He was a good man. He had his deep, deep beliefs, and he worked hard for us in the war. Interesting experience.
Well,
can I ask you a question? Because you touched on Eleanor ever so briefly, but as a female publisher, that was pretty groundbreaking. But did you ever any interaction with her? Do you think she helped women in the newsroom? Did she hinder them?
I don't know that she hindered them, but I don't think she was
sympathetic
to the women's movement. No. I do. I remember one of my first conversations with Eleanor was which is when I learned about the not saying hot in the paper. She would come up. I mean, she did wonderful philanthropy for the arts in Sacramento. Running a newspaper was not what she had prepared to do.
But she had strong opinions about certain things.
Yeah.
And if you crossed one of those opinions, she had the power and the influence to do it through her memos.
Yeah, that was when we tried to get permission for women to wear pants to work. She posted a memo there was a bulletin board in the newsroom. It was this long conversational memo about how she has noticed that women are wearing pantsuits to social events and so forth, and yeah, it goes on, and then at the very end it says, the Bee would prefer that women stick to their skirts. That was,
The men will wear the pants. The women should stick to their skirts.
Right.
Yeah. I thought I had a copy of that, but I cleaned my garage.
Well, the Women's Caucus and the Guild, I believe, filed one of possibly the first sex discrimination complaints against a major newspaper. It was in 1969, 1970. And right about the Newsweek case was filed around. There was one against AP, but it happened right after I had been assigned to cover an event at the Sutter Club, which was a male-only club, and it was a public meeting. It was a public meeting on air pollution, and I was assigned to cover environmental issues at that time. And the Capitol Bureau Chief, Marty Smith, who later became managing editor, he was great. He said, he was very supportive. I told him, I said, they don't let women in. This is well before my.
And I had already been turned away about 6 to 8 months before Sigrid was assigned to cover a Water Resources Board meeting, and showed up, and they said, I'm sorry, you can't come in. You can't cover this meeting. Called the desk, and they told me to come back. They would send a guy. Well, then Sigrid, 6 months later or so, 8 months later.
I just remember standing on the steps of the Sutter Club, and I wasn't going to storm the gates or anything. I noticed I was able to look inside. The doorman literally spread I weighed about 95 pounds in those days, and literally spread his arms across the door. We have some in-house cartoons. I can't find that particular one.
Oh, that was a great
pretty
one.
Funny. And I could see a woman, it was Ronald Reagan, it was a conference on air pollution that had been called by the governor, and it was a public meeting, and there was a woman engineer who was on the Assembly Science and Technology Advisory Committee. She had flown up from LA, and she was I could see her sitting at a desk with Reagan's people hovering around her, and she was very upset because she couldn't go into the meeting that she was asked to attend. And anyway, I called the desk, and they sent, and Marty Smith, the Capitol Bureau Chief, a pretty lofty to cover a meeting.
Yeah.
And they moved it across the street, because it's right across the street from the Capitol, and moved it across the street to the Capitol. And Marty did consult me about the story. And the headline the next day was on page 1. The headline was "Sex, Not Smog." It was made light of, at least in the headline. But what was worse was that when I got back to the newsroom, the managing editor, the same managing editor who'd yelled at me from across the newsroom when I wore pants with permission, he sent a memo down to the city desk. And none of this could have happened without discussions with the publisher and the editor was Jones and Eleanor at that time, and said, hereafter, it was just a directive, do not assign women to cover events in men's clubs, period. No.
Directive.
Well, that was the basis for our sex discrimination complaint, and we were very fortunate, because you have to go through the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, first before you go to court.
And also legally, those are public meetings. Those are public employees in it should have been in a public setting, and so there was a lot of ground to stand on. Besides that, I'm sorry.
Right,
go ahead,
and this EEOC investigator came in, and she just took the Bee apart. Went far beyond. She went into discrimination in advertising and hiring and promotion, and we never did have to go to court because we basically won
on the basis of her
on the basis of the investigation. But I learned later that there was another woman reporter there, Tracy Wood, who at that time was with UPI, and the bureau chief for Capitol Bureau Chief for UPI at that time was George Skelton, who remains a top political writer and former bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. George sent a memo to a letter to any men's clubs that were having events saying hereafter he would not assign any reporter to cover anything at a club that discriminated, period.
You won't be covered.
And the Bee was saying, that was my, women talk about that aha moment. That was when I thought, this is really wrong.
And things are changing.
And things are changing.
Slowly.
And I also want to mention one person we haven't, and it's hard to cover in a short amount
I want
of time.
to go back, and I know where you're going, and I'll let you go to Nancy, but you asked about Eleanor. Somewhere around here you have a copy of Thor Severson's book on the McClatchies. That is the most detailed information I've ever found about Eleanor's life.
It's very secretive.
Very secretive, but there are stories, lots of rumors. We heard many of them while we were working there about her life.
Like,
Well, there remains a question whether she was in Europe and married, eloped, and her parents came and got her, brought her back, and had it annulled. That is one of the stories that is out there. I have no verification on it, except that I've heard it more than once. There were other stories about what she wanted to do when she got out of college, and the fact that her parents absolutely said she was going back to Sacramento, hands down, and be on the family newspaper. That poor woman was probably pretty oppressed in many ways. I think she was smart. I think she loved the arts. If I engaged her in a conversation, she was very charming, very literate, but I don't think that woman got to live her own life. I don't know. All I know are rumors and what's in Thor's book.
there was one, and I can't remember if that's what's in his book or not, but it said that she left her husband because he had been abusive.
Oh,
That was written up after, when she died. There was an article that said that her husband had abused her and that there was an annulment.
Yeah.
well, she did, contributed a great deal to the arts community in Sacramento, theater community, and it was always very quiet. She was not seeking.
Anonymous.
Found it very difficult to make the changes that needed to be made to bring the Bee into the,
I did have some one-on-ones with Eleanor, and she was gracious. She certainly did not see my point of view when it came to women's issues. She was probably of my grandmother's ilk in terms of that women should always be ladies, that that we can always contribute to the conversation and lead people places, but we don't direct the conversation. I mean, there was very much that aspect in my conversations with her, and I had only probably 3 of them that were more than hello, how are you, blah blah blah. So but she was there. She came to the office.
oh yeah,
She wasn't never on the floor journalist.
I remember
never on the floor manager.
coming. I was having something to eat in the cafeteria, and she made sure. I mean, the cafeteria was good, and I probably would not have eaten very well if at that time we hadn't had the cafeteria.
Should we-
But she came and sat down at my table. I was by myself. It was an off time. I'd been out on a story, and it was hot. This is before I knew the hot rule at the Bee, and I'm trying to make conversation. I'd heard that she did this, that she would sometimes sit down when she saw, and she was very gracious and very charming, and we chit chatted, and I said I'd been out on a story, and we talked about that, and then and I said, and it's just really hot. She said, "Oh, I like the heat." And I thought, okay, where do I go from
How
here? And then
deeply ingrained is
and then
that? Since I
then
was 5
said,
years old.
Well, the air conditioner in my apartment, which was close to her house in the mansion district, over on 22nd, 23rd, and U, and I said the air conditioner in my apartment's broken, and that was true. It was, and she said, "Oh, I don't have air conditioning." And so
Not in those old houses up there on the hill.
Well, she had a Spanish tile
Right,
stucco,
that's right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
I can't remember where the conversation went after that. I do remember talking to Bill Glacken, the arts critic, about Eleanor. Is he quoted in the
I don't know, but he was,
Severson book?
I don't remember anymore. I read that a long, long time ago, but Bill was close to Eleanor. Bill could talk in Eleanor's ear. He had a strong influence in the management suite because of his age, his demeanor, his education. He was able to carry the message. He was really one of the good bridges across from the new young folks they were hiring and the people who had established the paper.
Plus, he'd been a political reporter. I didn't know that before.
I didn't
He
know
was an
that.
arts reporter.
I did.
Yeah,
I knew he was a math major at Berkeley.
Yeah, he talked about covering governors' press conferences that were, it was Earl Warren, around the governor's desk, and and people handing out.
He was a
lobbyists
wonderful man.
handing out bottles of liquor to the reporters. There were a few ethics issues.
Different
political
times, and when you
reporters.
look at this, you realize times continue to change. That what we're talking about seems so shocking when we came into the newsroom with these ideas, and that was just a progression. I was thinking the other day of Angela Davis. I remember, like you did with Gloria Steinem, I was sent to cover a talk by Angela Davis at Sac State. And okay, off I went. During her speech, she maligned the Bee more than once, that one-sided newspaper, the bigots, etc. She was quite harsh on the Bee. And after the talk, there was a small group gathering for the press, and I went in and we were there, and I raised my hand at one point, and I said, "I'm from that horrible newspaper, The Bee. You need to know before I ask my question." And she looked at me with a glint in the eye and a smile on her face like, "Yeah, I got you, girl. We'll do this. We both know what game we're playing." I mean, it was this instant flash. I loved it. She was very personable, very charming. She understood that we were adversaries, and it was an adversarial role that we were in, and the press often is an adversary. And if you recognize that, you can do a lot.
Well, there often, I don't want to talk only about women's issues because there was so much more to our time at the Bee, but the issues that women would cover, they're more sensitive, they're more emotional, that all of that.
More caring.
Stereotypical. But,
when
there were
someone would die in a plane crash,
stories
they'd send women.
I've
done a few of those, the Death Watch. We would be sent.
Women's health issues, for example, male reporters often don't, I think they do more now than they used to, but when I interviewed women political reporters for my master's thesis, which I called The Girls on the Bus, I was surprised that title hadn't been taken.
Used.
And,
there was a famous book, The Boys on the Bus. Okay.
Boys on the Bus, right. But the women, would talk about the kinds of stories that they would do, because I did in-depth interviews with women political reporters in the Capitol Press Corps and with the 3 Capitol Bureau chiefs who were all white males. And all of these women had experiences, covering stories that just weren't covered before. And they had to, stories on women's health issues, abortion issues, child care issues, issues that men are certainly concerned about, but they weren't covering those stories. And I did want to talk a little bit about how important it was when McCullough sent Nancy Skelton, who was plucked out of the women's activities section where she had been for 8 years.
Wait, is that long?
I remember the first time I met Nancy, I was turning in I felt I was somehow above I wasn't working in women's activities, right. I wasn't going to do that kind of reporting, arrogant. And but Nancy was turning in a story, and she'd been to a social event, and she had on this lovely black evening gown and long white gloves, and we're both turning our stories in at the city desk, and I thought, no, this is a really interesting person. And she ended up being one of the most important people on women's issues. In fact, she gave her, she won $500 in a San Francisco Press Club awards journalism contest when she had been covering the first Jerry Brown administration. Frank McCullough, I mean, that was just a huge thing to do, to send the first woman to the State Capitol Bureau, which is considered
Right.
to be a prestigious assignment, and assign her to cover the governor.
Not social issues.
She, really covered the Brown administration with tremendous tenacity and, just excellent reporting. She did, and he was difficult to cover in those days because he was very, he'd take off, go to London, and reporters would have to scurry along, and she was by that time
mom.
She had 3 kids and she was divorced, and so it was difficult. The scheduling was very difficult. She also had been through the she worked in women's activities. She got some great sources that she later used when she was covering Brown, because she got to be very close to his parents when she was covering social news, and she would get quotes from his dad that
Pat.
that were critical of his son's administration, and she just she did great reporting, and
Yes. And she really opened a path for a lot of us. You're not one kind of reporter. You are a reporter, and you can cover any subject in almost any field if you have a little bit of background and you know where you're going and you know how to do, know the skills of being a good reporter. And I think Nancy was able to say, without saying it in words, put me anywhere you want and I'll get you a damn good story.
Well, she really cemented her reputation as a Sacramento writer. When she started a column, it was simply called A Column, and it was about activities on our block, kids in school, the universal things that people, and it was enormously popular. And it started running. Well, did it ever run in women's activities, or was it only in scene?
No, it ran before my call. I followed Nancy with a column called Out of My Mind by Ann Reed, because I inherited Nancy's column. That is out of your mind. You don't take anything she had started. It was so good. I think that it did run in scene, but then they needed a page B1 article. I think McGinn left, and she moved. It moved to the General News.
To Metro.
Yeah, moved to Metro.
But it was a wonderful column, and she was also close to the editor and the publisher. And when one of the radical proposals that we had, when we proposed that there were competent women to be assistant city editors, and you'd think the building was going to blow up, I mean, it was such a mild proposal. There are women who could do this job. No, of course not. And Walter P. Jones, the publisher, comes marching down the hall, because his offices were down the hall, and walks up to Nancy. I think you were there.
Yeah, I was sitting. I can tell you where I was sitting when this conversation took place.
And what did he say?
He said, I can't remember, about women don't
have the gumption to be
city editor, and they shall, remain in the trenches.
Yeah, and he said it to Nancy.
Right, Nancy was here, I was here, and Walter came walking straight down this main hallway, and we were all going, what did he just do?
Yeah, and he had to really apologize for that, because the Guild, it was a public statement, and it was clearly a misogynist statement. He liked Nancy, because, and one of the few positive stories I ever heard, of course I got there at the end of his tenure, was that when she came back from, I think, her 3rd maternity leave, or a maternity leave, or she was scheduled to come back. The Bee didn't have maternity leaves. They didn't have maternity leaves when Ann and I had our children in the 70s. You just pasted together vacation time and
took time without pay.
Took time without pay.
And you had to tell them what day you were coming back. And I said, with or without a C-section? Huh? They didn't get it. And it was the you handle it era. There was no Me Too movement, nothing even close.
But she they terminated her. They weren't going to bring her back. She'd been
Right.
part-time, I think, before.
Yeah.
And Walter P. Jones intervened.
Right.
He liked her writing.
Thought she was a skilled writer. What a writer. He used to come out and actually tell her that.
So, and then she went to the Capitol and was an extremely skilled writer and went on to the LA Times. And this is a journalist who had been in women's activities covering social news, engagements, weddings, country clubs for 8 years before she was finally brought over to, actual, more serious reporting. But the McCullough years, which started in what, 74? Anne?
I was sending her picture. I don't know that it was it 1974?
74, 75. Yeah, I think it was 74.
Yeah, it was definitely before I had my kids, so it had to be then.
Yeah, and it just, I was considering going into a different profession. I was going to night school at McGeorge, as many reporters have done. And Frank came in, and he trusted his reporter. You had to show that you were doing serious reporting and be accountable, but he turned you loose.
And he was honest with the reporters. Frank taught me how to tell an employee no in a way that was honest and non-traumatizing. And that's because he told me no a couple of times for things I really, really wanted and thought I deserved. And he would explain why he thought he would explain very carefully, this isn't your time. You're smart, you can do it. There's another time for you. How about one of these three things? He taught me how to say no. I got a lot of experience from him in terms of management. And when I left the Bee and took on my first management job, where all of a sudden I had a staff of 16, I actually called Frank and said, "What do I do day one, Frank?" And he walked me through some suggestions.
Yeah.
So he liked his reporters. He knew his reporters' skills, their strengths and their weaknesses. And I think he worked very well with those.
Expected a lot of us.
Right.
Well, I was starting to get into some, covering courts and prisons, and I was assigned when Aaron Epstein was city editor. Briefly, he was way before his time, I'm afraid, at the Bee.
Yeah.
He was great. He was also a lawyer, and he wanted serious coverage of the courts. And he sent me over to federal court that was a time when you had a lot of conditions of confinement cases, prison cases, these handwritten writs, selective service cases. There were cases involving the birth control pill, and it's, how dangerous it could be in those high dose levels. And there were some really interesting trials. There was a trial involving occupation of PG&E land by a Native American tribe, the Pitt River Indians.
Right.
They were claiming it was their
Land.
their land, and
tribal land.
they had it. There was a case in federal court, and there was a case in state court. They occupied PG&E land and were arrested for trespassing, and then they occupied Forest Service land. So one was in federal court, and one was in. And this also illustrates some of the issues involving race and ethnicity at the
that we were
Bee.
talking about, that long entrenched.
Well, it was a very photogenic trial because the tribal leaders were bringing they were dressed in tribal attire, and there were babies in baskets, and they had a San Francisco lawyer who was brilliant. And this is all, in the halls of the federal courthouse. And so we had all these pictures, and they won both cases. Both charges were dismissed. And so when the story first ran, when I forget, it was either the state court case or the federal case, we had a lot of pictures, and they were running on page 1 above the fold. And by the time the final edition came around, it had been considerably reduced. It was still on page 1. Maybe it was the Metro section, I can't remember. But an editor friend told me that that there had been a lot of discussion, and somebody had said that's just too much Indian on the front page. I thought, okay. And I also
never any before this.
And I also got called in. Marty Smith had the the thankless job of managing editor at that time. And
tough job.
I had done a story on the weekend. We had a weekend editor who would kind of get things in on the weekends, and it was a history of the Pit River Indians, which is a tragic story, as much of the story of California indigenous people. Those stories are terrible stories, and so it was not it was the history. It was factual, and because we'd been running all these stories on these trials. And the story ran. It ran on a Monday morning, I think, and I get called into the managing editor's office, and he was very uncomfortable. He had obviously been, summoned from on high, and he said, the only problem some people had with the story is that you don't have two sides. And I've taught at Sac State now for 32 years, and I always tell students. At the time, I just remember thinking, well, what's the other side exactly? The genocide of Native Americans, And I was genuinely perplexed at the time, because you hear in the news business both sides. I tell students, two sides, 42 sides, 52 sides,
Opinion.
And then there is truth, and there are lies.
And opinions.
And it's your job to sort through all that and present it journalistically in a fair way. Objectivity is a really nice ideal to strive for, but it's difficult and difficult to define. I much prefer fairness.
Well, I like the definition of news. People always complain, well, it's always bad news. And the definition of news that I use when I teach is, news is the disruption of the status quo. That is why it is news when a plane falls out of the sky, and not news that 10,000 a day fly safely around the state. Mm-hmm. News is the disruption of the status quo. We're not after bad news. We're after something that people don't expect. That's what they will want to hear about, because they expect it to go a different way. So I think that's kind of what I always used as my touchstone. And sometimes I got into the same troubles that Sigrid did. I did I wrote about medical issues a lot. And there were two sides to the coin. Yeah. But I am giving you the newest information. This is brand new. It hasn't been out before. They're doing transplants now in Sacramento for the first time. That's news.